All right. What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is February 2nd, 2025. It's about 11:09 p.m. where I'm at right now. And this is part 2 of Booked 9 in our Booked React series, Slave Breeding, Sex, Violence, and Memory in African American History, written by Gregory D. Smithers. This book you can find on Amazon. It was published originally in 2012. You can find it for the humble price of only $18.39. And this is a continuation of our special Black History Month series, where we're going to be reading a lot of books on topics that are often not covered in the mainstream narrative about Black history. Now, the first part of this series I did yesterday, and I went over the author's biography. He is a distinguished professor currently right now, and he is still publishing books and doing research and studies and things like that. A well-renowned historian, so don't come in here saying that this person doesn't know what they're talking about. Second thing, I believe this book is important to read because it's a part of history, of course, like I said earlier, that is not often covered, and we need to remember the good as well as the traumatic and troubling about our history as Black people in this world. I'm reading this book right now privately for myself called Black and British by David Olusoga. It's one of the best books I've ever read about our history. And even though I am not British, I'm definitely Black. And there's a lot of information in this book that I am just floored by. And I'm going to be doing a video reviewing this as well. And we're going to be reading more books in the Book 3X series, so stay tuned for more of that content. But until then, let's get back into this. Yesterday as well, when I was reading, I fell asleep. I fell asleep live on Livestream. So if you want to see Simon Hill get to snoring and snoozing, go watch the first part of this series. But I got my coffee here. I got coffee right here for this one. So we're going to take a quick sip. And we're going to jump into this book, finish the introduction, and we're going to be completing chapter 1 of this book as well. So stay tuned for everything, and let's just jump right into it. By the Antebellum period, slave breeding had become a topic of intense debate at virtually every level of American culture and society. Within the private correspondence of slave owners and in the public instructions given to plantation overseers, masters liberally dispensed advice on how to best encourage successful breeding practices. Take the South Carolina planter James Henry Hammond, who gave explicit instructions to overseers on how to encourage quote-unquote marriage and ensure the good health of pregnant slave women and young children. While the law did not recognize slave marriages, slave owners such as Hammond encouraged the union between enslaved men and women because it had the potential to increase the slave population and thus the profits of the master. Marriage is to be encouraged, Hammond's instructions read, as it adds to the comfort, happiness, and health of those who enter upon it, besides ensuring a greater increase. Every effort was thus made on Hammond's plantation to ensure the survival of newborn slave children. Pregnant women at 5 months are put in the sucklers, breastfeeding women's gang. No plowing or lifting must be required of them. While pregnant women on the plantation had their manual labor reduced during the latter stages of pregnancy, breastfeeding women were charged with the important task of ensuring the health and well-being of the infant slaves. Hammond instructed that sucklers are not required to leave their houses until sunrise, when they leave their children at the children's house before going to the field. The period of suckling is 12 months. Their work lies always within 1/2 mile of the quarter. They are required to be cool before commencing to suckle, to wait 15 minutes at least in summer after reaching the children's house before nursing. Such clear directions indicate some slave owners' desire for, if not a sophisticated medical understanding of, the reproduction of the slave population and the breeding of nominally healthy slaves. So generally, it seemed like there was maternity leave. Even though it was unpaid, this is something that doesn't exist in America now, by and large. It's crazy. In slavery, there was maternity leave. But now under late stage capitalism, women work even while they're 9 months. Let's continue here. Hammond was not alone among slave owners in encouraging slave reproduction. On his Virginia plantation, Pharsalia William Massey purchased slave women who, according to the family records, played important roles as breeders. Pharsalia, by the way, was probably the name of his plantation. You know you're rich when your property has a name. The Monticello, the Pharsalia. If I'm rich, I'm calling mine the Rectum in honor of the film Irreversible, if you know what I'm talking about. All right. So the slave women, Judy, Millie, Sally, Rachel, Suki, Matilda, and Hannah, all feature prominently in Massey plantation records because they were considered particularly fecund bearers of slave children. The Massey family recorded births and monitored the mothering skills of enslaved women. For example, the slave woman Lizzie gave birth to a son, Gabriel, on June 21st, 1856. However, of subsequent entry records that Gabriel was murdered right out by his mother's neglect and barbarous cruelty on the 22nd of September, 1857. The monitoring of slave mothers whom planters assumed lacked nurturing instincts and possessed deficient mothering skills was regularly practiced at Pharsalia. That said, marriage was also encouraged among the enslaved at Pharsalia, just as it was on Hammond's plantation. But neither Hammond nor the Massey family promoted marriage out of any heartfelt concern for the emotional well-being of the enslaved. Instead, slave marriages were designed to maximize the efficiency and profitability of the Massey and Hammond plantations. Such practices reminded slaves of who was in control, who oppressed them, and who had the power to assent to the creation of life or to define the terms on which a slave's life ended. He says earlier that, this slave woman gave birth to a child and then the child died later. Now, of course, infant mortality, 100, 200, 300 years ago was much higher, as well as women dying from childbirth was much higher back then. But it makes me think of the film Beloved. If you've watched Beloved, you know what I'm talking about, how this slave woman who ran away was about to be recaptured with her children, and she ended up killing her baby and also was about to kill her other child instead of having them go back into slavery. It's hard to even imagine and think about, but I would not be surprised if a lot or some enslaved women killed their children, or if fathers did the same as well because they didn't want their children to go through that. In the book that we read before this, White Women, Black Men, Illicit Sex in the 19th Century South, infanticide of Black children born to white women before the end of slavery was very high. Many white women would kill their own children instead of raising them as Black men. So yeah, there's a deep history that we're talking about here, and it's going to get real dark. Forgive me if I make any crude jokes, but this is going to be the way that I deal. I have a dark sense of humor, so I can't guarantee that everything will always be, very tactful. But let's continue. The defenders of antebellum slavery denied accusations that slaves were sexually exploited or that they reproduced children for the slave owners' commercial gain. Instead, slavery's apologists asserted that slave owners acted with compassion and patriarchal concern for the enslaved. For example, the Barber County Agricultural Society of Alabama attempted to contradict a growing wave of abolitionist opposition to slavery when it reported in 1846 that because the slave is a valuable piece of property, we can readily conceive how strongly the motive of the master in taking good care of the slave, and thus extending the time of his usefulness. It was therefore a simple matter of economic self-interest that motivated the slave owner to ensure the good health of his quote-unquote crop of slaves, and to ensure that the slave's life as a productive laborer or reproducer of new slaves continued for as long as possible. However, this, according to the pro-slavery lobby, was not slave breeding. It merely reflected the paternalism that governed the slave owner's economic decisions and actions on behalf of his slaves. Slave owners persisted throughout the antebellum period with this type of self-deception, treating and quote-unquote managing the Negro with a view to increasing their cheerfulness. If this meant that the rate of slave reproduction increased, all the better. It did not mean, however, that efforts were being made to select and biologically engineer future generations of slaves. For example, the winning entry in the 1851 Planter Prize essay competition in Georgia instructed readers that females during a state of pregnancy should be exempt from all labor that would have a tendency to injure them, such as lifting heavy burdens, fencing, plowing, etc. And for several weeks previous to confinement, they should be required to perform no outdoor labor. By the way, I don't understand how that quote here denies the fact or denies the idea that slave owners were possibly genetically trying to engineer bigger and better slaves through selective breeding, right? Once again, the people that deny that slave breeding existed, that slave masters would purposely try to pair people off or have one person impregnate many women or one woman get pregnant a lot, deny the idea of even like basic capitalist reproduction. The idea that you can take your property and make it reproduce other property for your own financial gain seems to be basic 1 plus 1 equals 2 common sense under capitalism. Let's continue here. Despite persistent denials, all of this advice amounted to a desire in rhetoric, if not in scientific know-how, on the part of slave-owning and slave-trading interests to maximize profits through exploitative labor regimes and reproductive practices. To borrow a phrase from Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, slave breeding involved the naked self-interest in callous cash payment between slave traders, buyers, and masters for slaves who would breed prodigiously and work efficiently. Indeed, some recent historical scholarship has suggested that the commodification of sex among the enslaved and the offspring they produced highlighted the most brutal aspect of the chattel principle in the slave South, a principle that, as Chapter 1 demonstrates, a growing army of abolitionists and free labor, free soil politicians systematically critiqued after the 1830s. From an African-American perspective, it might be acknowledged that slaves shared with the master an interest in slave family formation, but their motives for doing so were based on an entirely different set of objectives. It is at this point that the trope of slave breeding casts new light on the debates about Black families that persist into the 21st century. Since the 1960s, historical analysis has exhibited great sensitivity to nuances in slave family formation. This work has grown in volume and sophistication since the publication of Daniel Patrick Moynihan's The Negro Family, A Case for National Action in 1965. The Moynihan Report, as it came to be known, built on early 20th century analyses by Black scholars like W.B. Du Bois and E. Franklin Frazier. Like these Black scholars, Moynihan identified the roots of Black poverty and family dislocation in slavery. Specifically, Moynihan detailed a tangled web of pathology that he argued resulted from the matriarchal nature of Black families. Since the publication of The Negro Family, a plethora of historical monographs have raised serious questions about Moynihan's conclusions. The following passages provide a brief summation of how some of the most prominent historians of the late 20th and early 21st centuries have addressed the topics of the slave family and the sexual exploitation of African American women. This overview should provide some basic historical background from which to contextualize the following discussions of slave breeding and the relationship of slave breeding to Black families. Since the late 1970s, the idea that African Americans were passive victims of enslavement has come under sustained revision. Historians such as Herbert Gutman, Eugene Genovese, George Rawick, and John Blassingame focused our attention away from the slave master and on 1950 to 1925, explored this agency by focusing on how Black families struggled to endure slavery and strove to carve out lives of dignified independence after slavery's demise. Notably absent from his analysis were references to slave breeding, a topic Gutman explored in detail with Richard Such just 1 year prior to the publication of The Black Family in Slavery and Freedom. However, given the growing emphasis that historians placed on the agency of historically marginalized peoples, this omission should not come as a surprise. Gutman wanted to destroy Moynihan's thesis by emphasizing strong family bonds and highlighting the ways in which African American people cultivated a strong spirit and independence of action that neither slavery nor Jim Crow segregation could extinguish. So the way I interpret this, I think, these writers, the guy who wrote The Black Family in Slavery and Freedom, I don't think he was saying like slavery was a choice, or even worse, that Black people enjoyed slavery and chose it over trying to strive for freedom. I think what he's trying to say here is that Black people under this system that they probably saw no way out of still decided to resist or build their own sort of identities and families under them. So if you are a person who is enslaved and you're trying to create this new life under this way that you can never imagine of getting out of, this is some sort of agency. I think that's what they're trying to say here. Let's continue here. The figure of the Black matriarch as a source of strength, as opposed to being the focal point of family pathology, did not attract serious historical attention until the 1980s. One book in particular, Deborah Gray's White Aren't I a Woman? Deborah Gray White's Aren't I a Woman, 1985, changed the way historians think about slavery and gender. While not losing sight of Black women's agency, White offered nuanced insights into the context in which that agency was exercised. For example, White did not shy away from contextualizing Black female agency against a historical backdrop in which sexual and reproductive abuses were not uncommon. Slave masters, White argued, wanted adolescent girls to have children, and to this end, they practiced a passive, though insidious, kind of breeding. Faced with such exploitative practices, White's enslaved women actively cultivated supportive emotional bonds with fellow slaves and developed strategies that proved pivotal or vital in navigating the inhumanity associated with the commodification of their sexuality and the implications this had for their families. I think, we have to remember also, slavery was the largest pedophile ring of all time. Right? Like what happened during slavery where so many children were sexually abused. It's insane. It's insane to even think about. I saw this picture in this book that I'm reading now of these slave children who were rescued from the ship. Here it is. I'm going to show this picture. Hopefully you can see it on camera. If you can't, I'll talk about this book more. But this is a picture of children. This is a real picture of children who were saved from a slave ship. And God knows what happened to them. You get what I'm saying? Like how much sexual abuse happened to children during Black slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, American slavery is insane to even comprehend. Anyway, when former slave women look back on their experiences in slavery during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they often appeared to speak openly about many aspects of slave life, except sexual abuse or the threat of sexual violence. Historian Darlene Clark Hine refers to this as the cult of dissemblance, a phrase that defines the behavior and attitudes of Black women that created the appearance of openness and disclosure, but actually shielded the truth of their inner lives and selves from their oppressors. Hine's formulation has produced a rethinking of Black women's history. Recent works by Michelle Mitchell, Lisa Matterson, and Daniel McGuire reflect how historians have paid much greater attention to how Hine's concept of dissemblance enables us to understand the politics of respectability that Black women helped to cultivate for over a century after the Civil War. If talk of slave breeding was ever muted, it was usually done so in the presence of whites and in adherence to the cult of respectability. Uppermost in the minds of African American people was a determination to shield family and friends from the types of racist and sexist stereotypes that Black women struggled to combat throughout the 20th century. Elsa Barkley Brown has written about these efforts, arguing that after slavery, the family and the concept of the community of family offered a unifying thread that bound African Americans together. Black women were instrumental in sewing these threads of family and community together, often forming the backbone of the churches and community organizations that institutionalized the family in African American culture. That is, making it a focal point of church and social organizations' activities, and helped its members deflect racist and sexist stereotypes that began in slavery. The following chapters will take up these issues in more detail. It is important to note, however, that even before slavery became a memory, Black women struggled against sexual violence, worried about children being torn from them, and grappled with the uncertainty of abroad marriages in which husband and wife resided on different plantations. Historians such as Anna Malone and Brenda Stevenson have chronicled these experiences. While the incidence of matriarchal families varied over time and space, the existence of single-parent matriarchal households did not prevent slaves from actively working to create stable, nurturing families. Under slavery, though, family, much less community, was tenuous. As a result, the notion of family was far more variegated than the imposition of a nuclear family model allows. As Stevenson argues, slaves wanted to forge enduring relationships, to marry whomever they wanted wanted and to control their own sexual activity and reproductive lives. Irrespective of how adaptable slaves attempted to make their family and community, enslaved African Americans recognized that when their master forced them to marry another slave, the intent behind that union seemed obvious: to breed slaves. So I think this goes back to the very important point that he's trying to make here in this book. We need to broaden our perspective on what slave breeding was like. It wasn't just, forcing a black man to go into a room and just hump on the first woman he sees, which did happen, of course. But, slave masters said, hey, Jim, wouldn't you like to marry Sally? Hey, go get married. And then they have like this mock wedding where they jump over the broom and everything. And then the goal of the slave master is that they have children so that he can, sell those children or use them to work and make more profit. Continuing here. Historian Mary Schwartz has taken up the issue of childbirth and breeding slaves in her research. In Birthing a Slave, 2006, she focuses on the history of medicine and gender, arguing that plantation management in the antebellum South centered on the struggle for domination centered on women's bodies. She insists that slave owners from Thomas Jefferson, who believed that a woman who brings a child every 2 years is more profitable than the best man on the farm, to the paternalists of 19th century America, aimed to purchase slave women who were, quote unquote, good breeders, invest money in the medical care of physically attractive childbearing women, and act as matchmakers to both increase reproductive rates and improve the stock. As Schwartz argues in the following chapters of this book demonstrate, the African American representation of the antebellum plantation as a breeding farm produced memories and historical narratives that intentionally characterize slavery as an inhuman institution in which sexual exploitation was commonplace, in which families were torn apart, and where the violent ways in which Black life was created and or brutally ended were emphasized. Connecting disparate threads of memory has long been viewed as a valid cultural enterprise in Black America. Such connections not only narrate the past, but impute meaning to the present. Feminist scholar Patricia Hill Collins, for example, connects the history of slave breeding and the actual breeding of quadroons and octoroons during slavery with the pornographic representation of Black Americans after slavery. Collins argues that America's history of racism and sexism is grounded in the antebellum exploitation of slave women as potential breeders and in the postbellum objectification of Black female sexuality. Since the civil rights movement, Black women have seemingly cast aside the cult of dissemblance and openly expressed indignation for slave breeding. For example, Josephine Carson presents an image of slavery in which slaves were made to work fields and to breed more marketable pounds of chattel by the plantation stud or his master. The African-American journalist Jill Nelson has written similarly damning condemnations of slavery's exploitation. Focusing on Black men, Nelson argues that during slavery, the purpose of the Black man was to work the field and function as a plantation stud, producing slaves or objects of ridicule. Ooh, that cut deep. Ooh, that cut deep. Okay. More recently, the legal scholar Pamela Bridgewater has placed the enduring legacy of slave breeding in African-American life in a legal context. Bridgewater argues that slave breeding was an integral component of the North American slave trade. She contends that slave owners used two methods to increase slave reproduction: a system of rewards and punishments, not unlike the freedom that was allegedly promised to Long Peggy after the birth of her 25th child, or a system of coercion and sexual abuse, such as the master or white overseer raping an enslaved woman. In her book, Breeding a Nation, 2009, the depth of Bridgewater's analysis comes into full view. She presents a bold argument contending that the abolition of the international slave trade to the United States in 1808 meant that the economic and political structure and survival of the South had relied on slave breeding. When Congress eventually debated the 13th Amendment after the Civil War, lawmakers understood that ending slavery and giving Black people their freedom would end the forced reproduction of Black babies on Southern plantations. The work of late 20th and early 21st century feminist scholars, along with recent histories of slavery and interracial sexuality, have given voice to an alternative definition of slave breeding that was long muted by the narrow definitions offered by economic and social social historians. By eschewing the list history or the narration of one event occurring after another that generations of predominantly white male economic and social historians have used to dismiss the accusation of slave breeding, scholars such as Bridgewater force us to reflect more deeply on what history is, what constitutes valid historical documentation, and how important subjective factors are in analyzing archival sources and representing historical truth. This book aims to build on this endeavor. In the 6 chapters that follow, I explore the history and memory of slave breeding from the perspectives of 19th century abolitionists, lost cause mythologizers, and late 19th and early 20th century historians, early 20th century Black playwrights, former slaves in the 1930s, Black scholars and civil rights leaders between the end of World War I and the modern civil rights movement, and in the literature, films, and folk tales by and about African Americans. As a whole, the chapters in this book problematize white Americans' hegemonic hold over the retelling of American history and of slavery's place in that history. Through different intellectual and cultural genres, we will see how African American memories of slave breeding expose the tension between vernacular interpretations of the past and professional historical narratives. These tensions are important because they force readers to grapple with a history that white folks don't like to hear about. This book will therefore challenge readers. Ultimately, however, it is my hope that slave breeding results in a richer, deeper, and more complex understanding of the importance of slave breeding in African American history and memory. Fire introduction. Great introduction. We just finished the introduction. Let's get into chapter 1. Hope y'all are still with me. If you have any comments, put it in the chat box. I got the chat box right here, and I'm going to be chopping it up with everybody. Let me take a quick swig of this coffee so I don't fall asleep. All right. American abolitionism and slave breeding discourse. From at least the 1770s and 1780s, anti-slavery groups in Britain and North America began coordinating political attacks on international slavery, initially focused on abolishing the international slave trade. By the turn of the 19th century, anti-slavery activists paid increased attention to sensational claims about slave breeding practices in the Caribbean and mainland North America. The anti-slavery focus on slave breeding intensified in the United States during the 1830s and 1840s, reaching a crescendo in the 1850s as Black and white abolitionists deployed sensational and sentimental rhetoric to attack the slave South. As one of the most important literary genres of the 18th and 19th centuries, sentimentalism was particularly important to abolitionist representations of slave breeding. Sentimental literature set out to appeal to the reader's moral senses. The goal of the author was to awaken one's feelings and emotions for a given subject. One need only skim through 19th century newspapers to see how often the word horror appears to describe audience or reader reaction to descriptions of the more lurid abuses of slavery. As Victoria Bynum observes of abolitionist descriptions of slavery, most white Americans were too horrified by tales of racial violence and lust to question their veracity. In this sense, sentimental literature increasingly became politically and morally charged during the 19th century. African American authors thus recognized the value of sentimental language in political discourse. As literary scholar Valerie Smith observes, Black abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs used the conventions of sentimental literature to undermine the cultural and socioeconomic structures that buttressed slavery. Abolitionists defined slave breeding as the coercive reproduction of new generations of slave laborers for sale and resale. They added that slave breeding practices highlighted the immoral commodification of reproductive sexuality in Caribbean and North American plantation societies. It was impossible to talk about slave breeding, abolitionists maintained, without also discussing the emotional and physical abuse that slave breeding schemes had on enslaved women, the anguish such practices caused when a husband, a wife, and or children were separated and sold away from family, and the violence and exploitative power that the slave-owning and slave-trading classes exercised over enslaved people. African American memories and representation of slave breeding began taking shape in this politically charged atmosphere and era of cultural sentimentalism. And before we delve into an analysis of these memories and representations, it is important to begin with a comparative overview of anti-slavery and abolitionist discourse from which these representations entered popular and political culture at the end of the 18th century. The representation of slave breeding practices ultimately coalesced around a general moral aversion to physical and emotional brutality in bourgeois culture during the 1840s and 1850s. Starting from this historical context allows us to do three things. First, we can reassess the political writings, speeches, and slave testimonies that referred to slave breeding prior to the outbreak of the Civil War. Second, we can develop a clearer picture of the relative importance that abolitionists placed on slave breeding allegations in their commentaries on compromise politics over slavery and debates about slavery's westward extension during the antebellum decades. Finally, by analyzing the public accusations of slave breeding, we begin to appreciate the importance that Black and white abolitionists placed on the images associated with sexual exploitation, racial violence, and family separation. By the antebellum era, Black abolitionists in particular focused on slave breeding as a key motivating factor for the violence experienced in slavery, particularly the abuses endured by enslaved women and their families. These representations gave the voiceless millions of enslaved people an important role in anti-slavery politics. While Black abolitionist spokespeople shared with white abolitionist colleagues a determination to prevent slavery's westward extension, Black spokespeople used slave breeding imagery to emphasize the slave's suffering, demand the immediate abolition of slavery, and insist on the importance of legal equality for all Americans. Thus, the images of slave breeding that Black abolitionists contributed to abolitionist discourse provided a less politically abstract rationale for slavery's immediate end and emphasized either firsthand experiences or eyewitness accounts that white abolitionists could only recite. Anglo-American abolitionism and slave breeding. In recent decades, historians have detailed the emergence and development of transatlantic abolitionism after the 1770s and 1780s. There exist scores of excellent historical accounts of the British abolitionist movement, the narrative of which is well known. It is worth emphasizing, however, that slavery and the international slave trade were phenomenally profitable components of the British Empire's economy during the last third of the 18th century. Historian Philip Morgan gives us a sense of just how important slavery was to the British Empire, arguing that between 1780 and 1810, the British trade in slaves amounted to some 80,000 shackled Africans per year. It was in this context and against seemingly insurmountable political and imperial odds that British abolitionists attacked the empire's interest in slavery and precipitated its decline. Indeed, British abolitionists were so successful in transforming Britain's political discourse about the international slave trade that British parliamentarians sitting within the hallowed halls of the House of Commons began to hear predictions of the consequences of its sudden demise long before an act to abolish the slave trade was passed into law. With the flows of slaves from Africa to the British Caribbean halted, British parliamentarians listened to lurid predictions of Caribbean planters developing an interest to keep up the slaves by breeding, if possible. Everything, Gregory is saying here is absolutely true. It rings off like this book I'm reading right here, Black and British by David Olusoga. Personally reading this, and I'm on page like 400 right now of that book. And yeah, what he's essentially saying here is like, at the beginning of the 19th century, abolitionism was about sentimentality, meaning like it was all about the feelings and emotions. And in David Olusoga's book, he says that, abolitionism mostly appealed to women. It was mostly, white British women who were on the front lines of that abolitionist movement to get rid of slavery, right? And against all odds, they were able to, end the importation of Black people from Africa to the Caribbean and all the other British territories that were owned in the Americas. And on top of that, about 30 years later, they ended slavery in all of Britain's colonies, right? So that was an amazing thing, going against rich, powerful slave owners, the capitalist class of Britain. This was an amazing thing that they were able to do by getting rid of slavery in the UK. And on top of that, the UK actually, wasn't known as the UK then, was it? was known as Britain, Great Britain, essentially, put their own ships on the line to fight the slave traders who were importing slaves out of Africa into the Americas. Continuing here. Alarming predictions of slave breeding in the British Caribbean became an increasingly common part of British debate about slavery during the first third of the 19th century. This was because abolitionists had been so successful in abolishing the transatlantic slave trade that late 18th century predictions became early 19th century reports of Caribbean plantation owners and overseers boasting of the success of their breeding schemes. Adam Hochschild observes that the operators of the Codrington plantation in Barbados claimed to have increased its slave population following the abolition of the British slave trade in 1807, thanks to breeding schemes. The great leader of British abolitionism, William Wilberforce, could not ignore these reports. He explained the unintended consequences of the British slave trade's abolition by suggesting that only after the abolition of the international slave trade would men apply their minds in earnest to effect the establishment of the breeding system. But men turning their minds to something does not always mean they will meet success. Much of the historical debate about slave breeding in the Caribbean is in reality a story of the trials and failures of Caribbean planters to stimulate reproduction among enslaved populations. Nonetheless, failure did not prevent British plantation owners from urging their overseers to implement practices designed to encourage the rapid increase in the slave labor force. On the Georgia estate in Jamaica, for example, plantation owner Thomas Gordon received word from his overseers in the 1820s and 1830s that consistent increases in slave population size were unattainable. In account ledgers that list slave births and deaths alongside those for livestock, Gordon could read for himself that failure of efforts to stimulate slave reproduction. Over the course of the 1820s and 1830s, slight increases in the slave population were recorded. However, by the 1830s, things changed dramatically. From 1832 to 1833, for instance, the number of adult slaves of reproductive age decreased from 168 to 154. Illness, disease, death, rebellions, and runaways, in addition to the use of contraceptives among the enslaved, may account for the drop in the adult population and a decline in the number of newborn and infant children. However, the intent behind efforts to stimulate slave reproduction in the Caribbean during the early 19th century was what truly alarmed abolitionists, and is an aspect of historical writing on abolitionism that remains underdeveloped. The British experience demonstrated to Black and white abolitionists in the United States that the abolition of the international slave trade had the potential to give rise to slave breeding schemes. This was something abolitionists were forced to grapple with from the early years of the American Republic. In this sense, American abolitionists had much to learn from the experiences of their British counterparts if they wanted to abolish slavery by root and branch and to perpetuate their own version of bourgeois sexual morality and monogamous marriage practices. During the late colonial and revolutionary eras in British North America, American abolitionists and lawmakers shared a preference for a gradual approach to the abolition of slavery in which former slave owners would receive financial compensation for the loss of their chattel. This was the path taken by the northeastern and mid-Atlantic colonies and states during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. As in Britain, American abolitionists tended to be non-slave holding, highly educated elites. By 1831, however, the year that William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, appeared for the first time, American abolitionist discourse changed dramatically. While happy that the international slave trade to the United States ended, in theory, in 1808, American abolitionists recognized the political battles that were tied to land and slaves in the early republic. The reproduction of the United States enslaved millions, and the labor they performed on Southern plantations drove an international web of finance, manufacturing, and trade. The global economy of the 19th century, abolitionists insisted, was driven by the exploitation of the slaves' reproduction and physical labor. In this context, American abolitionists demanded an immediate end to the internal slave trade and slavery in the United States. Abolishing the international slave trade to the United States became simply a starting point for ending a critically important cog in the American and Atlantic world economies, slavery and the internal slave trade in the American Republic. Garrison's language in the January 1831 edition of The Liberator, in which he pronounced that "I will not equivocate," prefaced the forceful tenor of immediate abolitionist rhetoric in the decades prior to the Civil War. Key figures in shaping abolitionist discourse during the antebellum era, such as Garrison and Susan B. Anthony, and African Americans like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, gave abolitionist rhetoric a radical edge that drowned out those antebellum voices espousing a gradual end to slavery. One of the defining aspects of radical abolitionism's rhetoric after the 1830s was its use of imagery designed to shock, disgust, and inspire ordinary Americans into demanding an immediate end to Southern slavery, lest its train of moral evil extend from the Atlantic to the Pacific coast. This became especially the case during the 1850s when, as historian David Leitner demonstrates, abolitionists and anti-slavery scholars raised their voices against slave trading and slave breeding practices to a fever pitch. Horrific tales of slave breeding became a staple of this radicalized rhetoric, more than it had been in the British abolitionist discourse. Audiences at anti-slavery meetings and readers of abolitionist newspapers thus confronted graphic stories of the cruelty and turpitude of slave breeding and slave exporting in the American South. I didn't know Susan B. Anthony was an abolitionist. Didn't know. Didn't even know that she lived around that time. I thought she came after. I thought she was born like after the Civil War. I don't know. Continuing here. The emergence of slave breeding discourse. Since at least the publication of Ronald Walter's important and thought-provoking analysis of abolitionist uses of sexual imagery in an American Quarterly essay in 1973, the interwoven histories of race, gender, and sexuality have received increasingly sophisticated historical analysis in the field. The scholarship of Walters and subsequent historians has highlighted how antebellum abolitionists became increasingly vociferous in expressing their anxiety about the vice, licentiousness, and immorality that slavery fostered in the American South. In articulating their anxieties about the immorality of slavery, antebellum abolitionists touched upon the tension between, what is this on my camera here? In articulating their anxieties about the immorality of slavery, antebellum abolitionists touched upon the tension between Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment concepts of individual choice, liberal ideas of legal equality, and notions of collective virtue in a territorially expanding American Republic. Historians have not fully explored the historical significance of the links between Republican settler colonial expansion and the ways in which abolitionists characterized the southern section of the Republic as one great Sodom, a sexually charged imagery that abolitionists used to highlight their anxiety about the moral nature of a future continental republic. Abolitionists, therefore, charged that slave owning and slave trading interests were compromising the delicate balance between liberal notions of legal equality and the Republican notions of collective virtue that ideally bound the states in union. The rhetorical use of slave breeding became an evocative narrative device in helping the American abolitionists make these points. This is very interesting, and that's something I've never thought of before. I think we forget, how conservative by our standards, like the 19th century was, like this idea, back then, it was illegal to have sex outside of marriage. Like fornication was a crime you could go to jail for, right? And think about this. If you're a Northern abolitionist who's all about Christianity, the Bible, and God is on your side and God wants you to free all the slaves. And then when you think about the South, what are the slave owners in the South doing? They are white men who are cheating on their wives by going out in the middle of the night to have sex with Black women who are not their wives. And on top of that, producing children that they sell into slavery. Oh, that's totally immoral, right? So these people are thinking like our nation needs to be moral. Our nation needs to be led by God. And the people in the South of America who are the slave owning class are godless heathens because they're having extramarital affairs, adultery, fornication, bastardy, they're producing bastard black children. This is something that I think maybe the abolitionists were like telling the rest of non-slave holding white America, hey, we got to get rid of slavery because not only are black people having sex with white women, but white men are losing their moral standing because they're committing these heinous, vicious things. Okay, anyway, continuing here. Abolitionist anxiety about Western expansion and the intellectual tension between 19th century liberal individualism and Republican virtue dominated anti-slavery discourse in the early Republic. As we will see, abolitionists expressed this tension in increasingly sentimental and sensational terms during the antebellum decades. What remained consistent in anti-slavery and abolitionist discourse throughout the late 18th century and into the 19th was the fear that the slave South's economic development and drive for new territories was connected to coercive human reproductive practices. Destroy slavery and the slave breeding practices that sustained the internal slave trade would wither and die, abolitionists maintain. The deployment of a discernible slave breeding discourse owed much to the writings and speeches of Black abolitionists during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, from Phillis Wheatley's poetry at the end of the 18th century to Frederick Douglass's tireless protests against the peculiar institution in antebellum America. Former slaves and free Blacks engaged in abolitionist discourse and opposed the aggressive pro-slavery lobby in the South. Thus, detailed references to slave breeding practices grew in regularity and narrative coherence as Black and white abolitionists added new narrative layers of sentimentality and sensational accusations about sexual exploitation. As early as the 1760s and the 1770s, formerly enslaved men and women spoke candidly about the types of sexual abuses that antebellum abolitionists would ultimately weave into narratives about slave breeding. Former slave women, for example, wrote about sexual coercion and violence and the acute feelings of despair that an enslaved mother experienced when her infant died suddenly or was forcibly removed from her through sale. In 1773, the former New England slave and poet Phillis Wheatley spoke for other enslaved mothers when she wrote about the anguish caused by the death of a child. No more the flowery scenes of pleasure rise, nor charming prospects greet the mental eyes. No more with joy we view that lovely face, smiling, disportive, flushed with every grace. The tear of sorrow flows from every eye. Groans answer groans, and sighs to sighs reply. What sudden pang shot through each aching heart when death, thy messenger, dispatched his dart. Thy dread attendants, all-destroying power, hurried the infant to his mortal hour. Infanticide, man. We spoke about this earlier. The death of children was very common during slavery, on purpose, unfortunately. Beautiful poetry from Phillis Wheatley. Shout out to Phillis Wheatley. She was a G. All right. Death provided finality to the separation of mother from child. Sale, on the other hand, perpetuated the deepest and most enduring of agonizing feelings for the mother of an enslaved child. Sojourner Truth, who famously met suspicion about her sex by asserting that her breasts had suckled many a white babe, recalled the struggles of enslaved families to maintain the chain of family affection. Maintaining bonds of kinship was an ongoing struggle for enslaved family members who were widely scattered by the internal slave trade. The testimony of former slaves played an instrumental role in the emergence of a powerful slave breeding discourse. In the early Republic, eyewitness accounts and participant testimonies emphasized sexual abuse, violence, and family separation through sale. Prior to the 1830s, however, Black and white abolitionists had not yet found the language necessary to wed these disparate violations into a coherent slave breeding narrative that challenged the pro-slavery lobby and the rhetoric of compromise politics over slavery's extension. As former slaves continued to add their voices to anti-slavery protests, non-slaveholding Americans were slowly forced to confront slavery's physical and emotional impact on African-American mothers, husbands, and children in the South. By the early 19th century, then, African-American leaders, writers, and orators refused to separate the politics of slavery from the personal and degrading dimensions associated with slavery's daily rhythms. Reflecting on how masters manipulated slave marriages, Solomon Bailey, a former Delaware slave, recalled his distress after being carried from my wife and children and from my natural place and from my chance for freedom. Bailey's words reveal much about how former slaves were increasingly connecting unrelated narrative threads about family, law, and freedom into a coherent anti-slavery discourse. By the second decade of the 19th century, abolitionists believed it was both politically expedient and morally necessary to expose the sexual abuses that enslaved women were reportedly experiencing. For example, Henry Watson, an African-American abolitionist, joined a growing chorus of sensational abolitionist attacks on slavery. Watson insisted that his former master was one of those proud Virginians whose principal business was to raise slaves for the market. Watson, who was born into slavery in 1813, described slavery as a fiery ordeal and the commercial exploitation of slave reproduction as a bitter cup. While there existed an economic motive to slave breeding in Virginia, Watson recalled that some masters were as vicious as wild animals toward their slaves. Mistresses, too, could be cruel and take delight in torturing their slaves. According to Watson, neither his master nor his mistress saw their cruel behavior as contrary to their economic interests. Indeed, some slaves might have been selected and used to raise new generations of chattel. But Watson's use of irony revealed that the animals in this process were the slave masters and mistresses. According to Watson, the slaveholder watches every moment of the slave, and if he is downcast or sad, in fact, if they are in any mood but laughing and singing and manifesting symptoms of perfect content at heart, they are said to have the devil in them, which is the common term, and they are often whipped or sold for their supposed wicked intentions. Watson thus described for readers a classic example of psychological projection and behavioral transference. He insisted that the adjectives used to describe the slave, such as devil, beast, or wicked intentions, actually characterize the psychological and behavioral habits of the white slave owner and the slave trading classes in the South. Watson's characterization of slavery was one that Black women were all too aware of. Prominent Black female abolitionists such as Sojourner Truth, Margaretta Fortin, Susan Paul, and the African-American Quakers Sarah and Grace Douglas all attempted to highlight slavery's licentious excesses. Many of these women had been free for several generations and went on to work closely with radical white abolitionists such as Garrison during the Antebellum era. Black abolitionist women believed, as the Douglas sisters believed, that their cause was the cause of God. Indeed, enslaved and formerly enslaved women needed all the spiritual power they could muster if they were to survive the physical traumas of slavery and the emotional turmoil of reliving scenes of sexual terror for abolitionist audiences. Scores of formerly enslaved women provided firsthand testimonies of slave owners interfering in the sexual, reproductive, and married lives of slaves. Nancy Howard, an escaped Maryland slave, remembered calling on God's help to see her through enslavement. She described her life in slavery as one of the blackest, the wickedest things that ever were in the world. By the 1830s, anti-slavery activists were becoming increasingly well-organized. As white and Black Americans joined abolitionist organizations, members found it impossible to ignore the way compromise politics in Washington, D.C. appeared to be perpetuating slavery's extension westward. The debate about slavery's westward expansion provided the political framework that abolitionists needed to focus the nation's attention on issues like the sexual exploitation of enslaved women, the violence of plantation discipline, and the cruelty of separating family members through sale. Abolitionists insisted that the territorial extension of slavery would perpetuate what they saw as a trend of moral and physical evils. In this context, the disparate threads of anti-slavery discourse during the early republic began to coalesce around the narrative of slave breeding. As one abolitionist quipped, the extension of slavery provides a new motive to the slave breeding states to stock the market with human cattle. Brian C. says hello. Hello to Brian C. out there. Shout out to everybody tuning in. We got a lot of people who are watching right now, but nobody's jumping in the chat. So I'm glad y'all are either paying attention to the book or y'all just want to hear me read it. However you're doing, if you're driving the car, washing dishes, whatever, hope you're, enjoying this book. And I would love to hear people's thoughts about, the history of slave breeding as we're discovering it in these pages. Let's continue here. So, antebellum abolitionists linked Western expansion to slave breeding by arguing that the Upper South raised slaves for sale in the Lower South and Southwest. Abolitionists charged that the infertile soil in states such as Virginia and Maryland, which allegedly made large plantations based on agricultural production unprofitable, encouraged the breeding and sale of vast quantities of slaves in the Lower South. That's interesting because, Thomas Jefferson had his famous Monticello plantation in Virginia. Did Thomas Jefferson not make money on his plantation? Was he not a rich man? I don't know. One anti-slavery writer explained that the northern slave states, whose soil the system exhausted, have acquired a new interest in slavery by humbling themselves to the condition of slave breeding and slave trading communities. Accusations of this nature crystallized in abolitionist discourses over the course of the antebellum era. Theodore Parker, for example, labeled Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Missouri as the slave breeding states. And an anonymous author writing in the Christian Spectator described the brutal system of slave breeding supported by every device of cruelty and oppression, and resulting in a degradation of body and soul at which all civilized nations cry out with horror. Interesting. So I heard, if y'all know Tariq Nasheed, Mr. FBA, one of the funniest things Tariq Nasheed said is that in Maryland, it's very common for Black people to date and sleep with their cousins, right? Because Maryland was the slave breeding state. I'll never forget when Tariq Nasheed said that. And he said, if you ever meet somebody from Maryland, they got a big ass head. And they got them big ass pumpkin heads because they're the descendants of Black people who were forced to breed with their own relatives. I know that's a crazy thing, and I'm sure Tariq Nasheed just pulled that out of his ass, but I think that sort of bolsters Gregory Smithers' argument here that Black people, we retell stories of the trauma that we went through to create answers for our present condition. I mean, just think about the story of, who was that slave guy? Man, you know the story of that slave master who wrote a letter to somebody in Jamaica and said, this is how you break slaves. You divide the dark ones from the light ones. You make the men fight the women. You separate the families. And then you have slaves who will always be permanent slaves because they'll fight each other. I forgot the name of that letter. Willie Lynch. Yeah, the Willie Lynch letter. Like the Willie Lynch letter is a way that we retell the story. It doesn't have to come from actual history, but we know that's, true, right? It's true, but it's not true, if that makes sense. Let's continue. So in the South, pamphleteers and newspaper editors characterized slave breeding allegations as evidence of sensationalized abolitionist propaganda designed to destroy Southern civilization. Southerners with a direct socioeconomic interest in slavery and the internal slave trade insisted that abolitionist attempts to link the westward expansion of slavery to slave breeding was both scandalous and baseless. Indeed, pro-slavery politicians and propagandists insisted that allusions to the sexual exploitation of the enslaved were a distraction in the debate about slavery's extension and the North's hostility toward the South's politics and way of life. The real issue, pro-slavery politicians argued, was simple. Slavery must extend into the West or die. As pro-slavery ideologues saw things, the issue of slavery's Western extension was about the future economic viability of the South and the expansion of the region's noble form of civilization. Nothing more, nothing less. Pro-slavery pamphleteers and the newspaper editors believed that the best defense against the scurrilous accusation of abolitionists lay in highlighting how slavery constituted a positive good. Southern slavery, the argument went, was an institution in keeping with the Republican ideals and humanitarian impulses embedded in American society. Southern paternalism, therefore, emphasized the obligations the master felt for his quote-unquote family. The master's white wife and children, in addition to his slaves, were part of a plantation family that the master felt obligated to protect and nurture. Southern paternalism also involved reciprocal responsibilities. Slaves reportedly felt a deep attachment to their white master and mistress, expressed in a determination to fulfill their duties as laborers. In return for faithful service, plantation owners encouraged their slaves to marry and form families. Thus, Southern slavery was portrayed as a socio-economic system that was mutually beneficial to masters and slaves. Abolitionists responded to such arguments by turning pro-slavery arguments against the South. For example, the accusation that the Upper South raised slaves for sale in the Lower South received what its exponents claimed was academic credibility following the publication of Thomas Roderick Dew's report on debate in the Virginia legislature during 1831 and 1832. Dew, a professor of political law at the College of William and Mary in Virginia and a pro-slavery advocate, claimed that from all the information we can obtain, we have no hesitation in saying that upwards of 6,000 slaves are yearly exported from Virginia to other states and are a source of wealth to Virginia. Economic gain from the sexual exploitation and suffering of other human beings was the worst kind of sin in the minds of abolitionists. Dew's report, abolitionists insisted, provided the empirical evidence needed to support accusations of slave breeding against the Upper South. The leveling of slave breeding allegations against slave owners and slave traders provided abolitionists with a rhetorical device to critique the politics of territorial expansion and the unethical conduct of slaveholding and slave trading interests in American social and economic life. During the 1830s, sentimental and sensational rhetoric thus combined with the hard-bitten political discourse of sectionalism to make for an explosive antebellum debate over slavery's extension westward. For example, Elizabeth Margaret Chandler, the Quaker poet, appealed to the nation's conscience when she asserted that the internal slave trade is a guilt and an infamy for which our country has no excuse. Sentiments of this nature made their way into the rough and tumble world of state and federal politics. Slave breeding became an important component of political debates in the battle to shape the discourse about American territorial expansion. The abolitionist Theodore Dwight Weld, like so many abolitionists, drew on Dew's analysis of the Virginia legislature's proceedings to both condemn Virginia lawmakers and oppose the extension of slavery into the West. Weld argued that Virginia's effort to legally expel free blacks from the state was failing because of slave breeding practices. The immigration of free blacks and freed slaves, Weld claimed, failed to check the growth of Virginia's black population because it furnishes every inducement to the master to attend to the Negroes, to encourage breeding in big, bold capital letters, and to cause the greatest number possible to be raised. So yeah, basically what they're saying here is that Virginia didn't have the soil it needed to grow cotton or tobacco or tomatoes, right? But they definitely had a lot of N-words, a lot of Negroes that they could force to have sex that they could sell to Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. Continuing here. So Weld was far from a lone abolitionist voice in making such accusations. William Ellery Channing was one of the nation's leading Unitarian preachers and a staunch abolitionist. Shout out to the Unitarians. And he warned that the American Republic's extension into the West could play into the hands of slave-owning and slave-trading interests. Channing's concerns were a product of the powder keg that was sectional politics in antebellum America. Politicians from frontier states and territories, such as Thomas Hart Benton, faced public opposition from their pro-slavery constituents after they appeared to support abolitionist arguments. Southern and pro-slavery Americans thus grew increasingly sensitive to attacks on slavery because they feared the vassalage of the abolitionists and territorial restrictions being placed on their way of life. The jurist and pro-slavery writer William Harper responded to the rising abolitionist tide by arguing that the failure to extend slavery westward would retard the advance of civilization in the plains and forests of the West. In stark contrast, abolitionists viewed the extension of slavery as a wrong done to humanity. Commenting on the heated debates over the admission of Texas into the Union, Channing cautioned that the acquisition of new Western territories would provide potential new markets for slave breeders. By annexing Texas, Channing argued, we shall not only create it, demand for slave breeding where it does not exist, but breathe new life into it. Like Henry Ward Beecher, Channing may have been zealous in his anti-slavery preaching, but his keen intellect allowed him to see the question of slavery's extension for what he believed it was, an issue that struck at the moral core and meaning of the Republic's founding and westward expansion. Let's take a look at this picture right here. The United States Slave Trade, 1830, an example of abolitionist propaganda that insinuates a link between internal slave trade and the federal government's implicit approval of that trade, right here. So yeah, I think what this picture is trying to say, America is expanding. I mean, at this time, America was only a handful of states. We were moving past the Mississippi, going into, the Western territories after the Louisiana Purchase. And so, yeah, people that were representing their states like Pennsylvania, New York, Maine, whatever, they're saying, hey, these, slave owners, they're expanding into the West. And who knows, the West might be like the South. Imagine California being as shitty as Louisiana. Imagine Oregon being as poor as Mississippi. You get what I'm saying? So if slavery expanded into the West, we might have big, fat, nasty black and white women out there on the West Coast, like we have in Texas, like we have in Florida. You get what I'm saying? Like, slavery is gross because it makes people be like the South, and that's not what we want. The South is the worst part of the United States, and it's because of slavery. It's because of slavery. Let's continue here. The memory of what the Republic's founding fathers said and did not say about slavery was reshaped in this volatile political climate. Citing the opinion of the Chancellor of New York State, the editors of the Anti-Slavery Record asserted that slavery and legal efforts to return freed slaves to a state of bondage was contrary to what the patriots of the Revolution who framed the Constitution of the United States and had incorporated into the Declaration of Independence had intended. The founders, however, rarely spoke explicitly about slavery. While many agonized over the question of slavery in a republic devoted to the principles of legal equality, in the end, the founding fathers left the question of slavery for future generations to resolve. In their own time, the founders struck compromises that included the abolition of the international slave trade to the United States by 1808, a decision that 19th century abolitionists saw as a stimulus to slave breeding interests within the republic. Memory and politics proved a powerful cocktail for abolitionists as they condemned the slave breeding South and launched rhetorical attacks on lawmakers in Washington for not immediately abolishing slavery and the internal slave trade. One writer, arguing with typical Garrisonian bluntness, condemned the federal government for being deeply involved in the guilt of violating the most sacred rights of liberty. Washington is the very focus of the slave breeding trade. Such views were both sensational and sentimental in nature, but they were becoming more common in abolitionist discourse during the 1830s. Both black and white abolitionists therefore seized on slave breeding as an evocative rhetorical device to elicit support for their bourgeois moral position, a position that linked liberal concerns about the sanctity of the marriage contract with Republican anxiety about the common good for all Americans. Slave breeding discourse in the 1840s and 1850s is the next section. Quick coffee break. I love a good cup of Joe at 12 a.m. Now I won't be able to sleep. I make so many sacrifices for this channel, if y'all only knew. By the 1840s, the nation had established a tradition of lurching from one unsatisfactory compromise on slavery to the next. As tempers flared and sectional debate became increasingly cantankerous, abolitionists expressed displeasure over what they saw as Congress's ineffectual treatment of slavery and slave breeding interests. Indeed, more radical abolitionist voices were quick to point out that the ban on the importation of slaves into the United States after 1808, combined with pro-Southern compromises on slavery, meant that slave breeding interests had all the inducement necessary to expand their business westward. Joshua Reed Giddings, a militant abolitionist politician from Ohio, articulated these sentiments when he stood before the U.S. Congress in 1843 and railed against slave growers, just 1 year after Congress censured him for his strident abolitionist views. Giddings was breathing rhetorical fire when he declared that corruption has marked every stage of the Constitution's progress, and baseness has characterized those who have aided in carrying it forward. The whole was managed by slave breeders and slave traders, aided by Northern men with Southern principles. An indication of just how persuasive abolitionist accusations of slave breeding were becoming in antebellum discourse can be seen in the writings of Ezra Champion Seaman. Born in upstate New York in 1805, Seaman wrote extensively on American politics and the law. although he was by no means a radical, when he turned his ambition to the inhuman practice of slave breeding in 1846, his prose became blunt in its accusatory tone. The northern slave states, he argued, have obtained the name of tobacco and slave breeding states, and the southern slave states the name of cotton growing states. Seaman accused slave owners in Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, and other upper southern states of breeding and selling slaves to supply the ever-increasing labor demand of the cotton-growing states. In the wake of the international trade in slaves being abolished, Seaman charged that slave breeding has been one of the principal resources for northern slave states during the last 30 years, and a reliable provider of slave labor for planters determined to extend slavery into the West. Former U.S. President John Quincy Adams offered an equally impassioned criticism of what he believed was the determination of the pro-slavery lobby to extend slavery westward, thereby perpetuating slave breeding practices. Speaking before the Massachusetts constituency on the issue of Texas and slavery's extension, Adams referred to the slave breeding passion for territorial annexation. He carefully described for his audience the political line that divided the slave breeding conspiracy against the freedom of the North, a binary division that, according to Adams, explained the tenor of compromise politics on territorial expansion. Of the slave breeding conspiracy, Adams left his audience in little doubt of the South's intent to obtain a nursery of slave-holding states to break down forever the ascendant power of the free states and to fortify beyond all possibility of reversal the institution of slavery. So basically what he's trying to say here, this is President Adams saying basically the slave states are trying to expand, and they're going to continue to expand until the majority of states in the Union are slave-owning states, making the free states a minority. Thank God the Civil War happened. Thank God the Civil War happened. Thank God the Civil War happened, because it's amazing the fact that we were able to defeat a large amount of rich capitalists who had an army that they raised in several states they took with them just to hold Black people in bondage. Thank God the Civil War happened. Thank God all those people died. Thank God the Civil War happened, man. It's just amazing. Like, the more you read and think about it, like, damn, we defeated an oligarchic class of slave-owning bastards who wanted to destroy the Union. Like, thank God. Anyway, by the 1840s, slave breeding discourse had become shorthand for abolitionist claims about the South's moral bankruptcy. Maria W. Stewart, an African-American abolitionist, emphasized this position in her anti-slavery writings. Stewart, who was born in Connecticut in 1803 and orphaned at age 5, emphasized the wretched and degraded situation foisted on enslaved women by the practitioners of slave breeding schemes. She added a religious note to her moral condemnation of the slave South, claiming that Christianity, in contrast to slavery, is pure. It is ever new. It is ever beautiful. It is all that is worth living for. It is worth dying for. Guided by Christian principles, Stewart argued that enslaved mothers struggled to endure the physical pain of sexual exploitation and the psychological trauma of rape. Believing they had God on their side, enslaved women steeled themselves to be mothers who, against all odds, strove to create in the minds of your little girls and boys a thirst of knowledge and the love of virtue, the abhorrence of vice, and the cultivation of a pure heart. The testimonies of former slaves became especially important to abolitionist discourse during the 1850s. This was arguably the most turbulent decade in American political history. During these years, abolitionists and their political allies rallied against compromise politics, labeling it a complete failure that simply played into the hands of the pro-slavery lobby and slave breeding interest. Anti-slavery politicians and abolitionists thus stepped up the rhetorical attack on slavery in the decade before the Civil War. For instance, abolitionists viewed the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which overturned the Missouri Compromise, as examples of Congress's apparent willingness to ensure the continuation of slavery and the extension of slave breeding practices. Abolitionist claims about slave breeding practices therefore increased in intensity. At the same time, criticism for the inadequacies of compromise politics also increased. The African-American Ohioan Charles H. Langston typified abolitionist frustrations when he criticized the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Langston complained that I know that the courts of this country, the laws of this country, that the governmental machinery of this country are so constituted as to oppress and outrage colored men, men of my complexion. I cannot then, of course, expect, judge from the past history of the country, any mercy from the laws, from the Constitution, or from the courts of this country. He's damn right, damn right. George Beryl Cheever was similarly condemnatory. Cheever criticized compromise politics and added that our Declaration of Independence, hitherto the hugest colossal maul under God's word, that the angel of freedom himself could swing against the thrones of tyranny and beat upon the heads of the ferocious and cunning despots of humanity, is no better than the feather dipped in olive oil. He added that the political representatives of the slave breeders and slave traders take the doctrines of popular sovereignty and convert them into a network of usurpation and of tyranny, more subtle, more knotted, more implacable, and in league with the power put at their command, constituting a despotism more hopeless because the vaunted principles of your democracy have been perverted into its support than all the Nimrods or Napoleons, or even the houses of Habsburg in Austria, sublimity of oppression ever intended. God, thank God the way people wrote in the 19th century is over, because basically all these people are saying is like the slave owners and slave breeders, all these people who are pro-slavery in America, they're basically wicked and evil, right? And they're the forefathers of the wicked and evil people that are running America today, unfortunately. But let's continue here. Cheever's unvarnished criticism of the American political and legal system's pro-slavery sympathies was not an isolated screed against the expansionist tendencies of the slave South. James F.W. Johnston, for example, joined Cheever and other prominent abolitionists in condemning compromise politics and the American legal system as proxies for slave breeding interests in the South. It cannot be doubted Johnston informed an international audience in the London Quarterly Review that a fresh and most potent stimulus will be given to this slave breeding and traffic of blacks